If you're 50 years old or under, you probably won't understand this reference, but he was known as Nixon's hatchet man. He once famously said, "I'd walk over my own grandmother to re-elect Nixon." He served 7 months in federal prison for obstruction of justice in his role in the Watergate cover-up. And in 2012, he died, and his true life became known to everyone. None other than NPR Radio News said this about him: Colson proved the skeptics wrong over the next 3+ decades after his imprisonment, because Colson has walked his talk in a very convincing way. Many of you know that I'm talking about Charles Colson, a lawyer who was with Nixon during the Watergate cover-up, and was famously put in jail, and people who were against Nixon, his enemies, were enthralled that his hatchet man, his point man, was behind bars. But God did something amazing in Chuck Colson's life. And most of the world had no idea the life Chuck Colson was living. He started something called Prison Fellowship here in America. It's now in countries all over the world. It brings the gospel of Christ and prison reform into prisons everywhere. That was unknown. It was not highly touted in any media. After Colson was imprisoned, the media forgot about him and went on to other things, and so did most of America. But at his death, note was made in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and on NPR radio about how Colson had actually lived his life. There's an old lumberjack proverb that says, "A tree is best measured when it's down." When a tree is down, we can judge the greatness of the tree with unquestioning confidence, because there's something to examine. We can examine not only the cross-section of the trunk and look at the rings and measure its life and maybe some destructive elements that have come into it, but we can look at every branch and every limb up close and see the greatness or the maladies, the frailty of the tree. It can no longer hide who it truly was or what it truly was, because everybody can see and the facts are in. And the death of most people is just like that. Once the life is over, a full examination can be made. We can either bring them down to size, because they were thought more of than they should have been, or we can be overwhelmed and understand that they were worthy of even more respect. And that's what we have here this morning. We are looking at the legacy of Abraham. We've been for the last 15 or so weeks, 16 I guess, looking at Abraham's life as he lived it. Now we are taking another view of Abraham's life as someone who's no longer living, and what is his legacy. So his legacy is really talked about not in the Old Testament where we read his story, but in the New Testament, as the writer of Hebrews is looking back over what's called the Hall of Fame of Faith, or the Hall of Faith of many Old Testament saints, and he spends quite a lot of time on Abraham, writing about Abraham's life and really bringing to us this understanding of how great Abraham is. And Abraham is thought of as great by almost half the people living in the world right now, because he is known, as I told you before, in the 3 major monotheistic religions. He's known. Judaism, of course, Christianity, of course, and even Islam all exalt Abraham as a father of their faith, as someone to be imitated, someone to be looked at with respect. So we see in just a few short verses here in Hebrews the greatness of a man. But we aren't supposed to walk away just enamored with Abraham. We are to walk away with an understanding that we too can follow Abraham's leading, Abraham's path, because the same God that spoke and led Abraham is the same God that speaks and leads you and me if we choose to follow him. I've devised or come up with 4 lessons. I've learned these from other writers. I didn't come up with all of them by myself, but 4 of them I want to put before you that provide an outlook or a sketch or maybe an easy way to understand and live as Abraham did. These are like points on a compass. They just kind of help you keep things in the right place. They steer you well on your journey through spiritual life and into maturity. They are, as written in your bulletins outline, simple to understand, challenging to apply, and will take a lifetime to master. But the first one says, wherever God leads, we should follow. Just like Abraham did, wherever God leads, we should follow. This is what the writer of Hebrews says. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know what? Where he was going. He was told to go someplace. Well, where? Just start walking. And he did. Wherever God leads, follow. God's not going to break his rules with you and me. He's not going to tell you step 10 if you haven't taken the first step. He's not going to tell you how all this is going to end if you haven't yet started on the journey. He's just saying, son, daughter, take the next step. It will all come to you, but trust me on the first step. When he was called, he obeyed. That's the lesson, the first one anyway, that we see in Abraham's life. Notice he did this by what? Did he have a blueprint? Did God tell him everything that happened before it was going to happen? No, he did it by what? By faith. Faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you don't see. That is faith. That's very difficult. It's easy for me to say that. But if you were to travel with me on this next week, you'll see me get to a place of faith, and I will hesitate. I will say, well, I don't see it. I know it's there, kind of. But will I, and God is saying, Dean, trust me. Trust me. Take that next step. He says that to you as well. I heard one writer say it like this. When Abraham walked by faith, it means he exchanged the known for the unknown. Isn't that amazing? He exchanged the known, his life as he knew it, and he knew what was going to happen in his life. He could sit there and, well, this is going to happen when I'm this age, and that happens, to the unknown. God said, get up and move. Where? I'm not telling you yet. Just keep going. That's the unknown. And Abraham was able to trade the known for the unknown. Remember, when God says walk and we take the next step, that great reward await when we obey without knowing all the details. Great rewards await us when we obey without knowing all the details. God may be positioning you right now to take a step of faith, and you're like, I'm not sure. And God's going to tell you, well, sometimes you're not going to be sure, but you have to step out. You have to do this. You have to obey when you don't know all the details. If you know the next step, trust me to take that one. And trust me that when the next step comes after that, I'll tell you and I'll show you. But you're never going to get anywhere if you don't take the first one. Many people don't experience a faith journey because they won't take the first step without knowing where the hidden path leads. There are some things in your life, in my life right now, that God's asking you to do, and you're saying, I don't know if I should do that because I don't know how this is all going to end, and if I had some type of guarantee that it would all work out, then I would do it. But right now, I just feel more at peace if I just don't. It would just be easier if I just let this one slide by and wait for the next opportunity. Maybe I'll go then. Too much risk right now, Father. Too much risk of the unknown. The problem is that we don't take a faith journey when we let that paralyze us. We have to take the next step without knowing it. It begins by asking ourselves how much faith is required to move forward. Here's the problem, though. When we reject God's leading, we forfeit His best, and instead we accept mediocrity. I think we're going to meet some people in heaven. We may even be one of them. Probably I think I would be one of them who's going to say, wow, did I miss the boat? Did I really settle for less because I didn't take the steps of faith? I didn't do what God asked me to do. I played it safe, and I really settled for much less. And with unjealous eyes and an unburdened heart, we're going to be able to joyously look at others in heaven who had the faith. And God is exalting them for eternity because of the faith they showed in those instances. Abraham's going to be one of those, although Abraham didn't get it right all the time. But when we reject God's leading, we forfeit His best and we accept mediocrity. This is never a good trade for us. It's not a good thing for us to do. We can resolve wherever we're at right now, how many times we may have said no. The next time that comes around, the step of faith, we can say yes. And we will see God's hand of faith take us forward at that moment. The second lesson I think we draw from Abraham's life and death is whatever God promises, we should believe. Whatever God promises, we believe. It's very akin to the first one, but it's a different facet of the same idea. Whatever God promises, we believe. The writer of Hebrew continues, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. What was the promise? I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to make you a great nation. More people are going to be in your nation than there are stars in the firmament in the sky, sand on the shore. But they had to walk in faith. They had to believe the promises. And they had to make choices based on that belief. The writer of Romans is Paul, the apostle, New Testament fellow, of course. He put it like this, and I have it in a different translation. It's called The Message. You may have heard of it. But it puts it in everyday language. And this is what Paul said in verses 19 to 21 of chapter 4 of Romans. Abraham didn't focus on his own impotence and say it's hopeless. This 100-year-old body could never father a child, nor did he survey Sarah's decades of infertility and give up. He didn't tiptoe around God's promise, asking cautiously skeptical questions. He plunged into the promise and came up strong, ready for God, sure that God would make good on what he had said. Sure that God would make good on what God promised him to do. Abraham was 75 years old when he was told, you're going to have a son named Isaac, or you're going to have a son and I'm going to build a nation from your one son, your son of promise. He was 75. You say, well, did he marry Sarah when she was young? Well, yeah, but she was 65. She wasn't having kids, folks. Her menopause had come and went. And went. And went. 65 years old. She didn't have the kid at 65. She had him much later. But the promise was given at 65 years old. Do you believe God when he says things? When you read things in the Word of God, do you think they're for you? Do you think he still works the same way? Do you think the same God that promised Israel he would deliver them out of the bondage of slavery in Egypt will deliver you, will provide for you? I have trouble believing that sometimes. I get to a crossroads in my life and I say, I don't know. This week I've been worried. I've been talking a lot about myself the last couple of weeks, and I apologize. But this week, I had my son on my mind because he left home for the first time. He's over all the way in the far-off land of Orlando. Miles from here. It was hard. Someone asked me, is the house weird now? But yeah, it's strange because he's not there. And all week long I was making adjustments. And I remember hearing something about what's going on. He won't text me, he texts his sister. And his sister still lives under my roof, so I make her tell me what he said. And I said, what's he doing? And she told me some things like, and God said, Dean, I got this. I know, but Dean, I got this. I know you got it, but And so, a couple of times this week I had to sit down and God had to say, down, Dean. I brought plagues on Egypt to get them out of there. You think I can take care of your kid who's just a couple hours away in a college? Yeah, I think you can. All right, calm down. Thank you, Father. Folks, we all do that. We all go through these steps. Whatever God promises, we have to believe. Guard against, though, like I have to, letting the difficulty of a choice keep you from accepting the challenge of doing what he asks. Having peace in the midst of the throes of an unknown. You don't know how it's going to end. You're not sure if it's going to work out. Having peace in those moments is an act of faith. To keep walking after Jesus as he leads you through these terrible times is what Abraham had to do. He faced some terrible times after he left his homeland in Ur, which is modern-day Iraq. He faced some tough times doing what God asked him to do, but he followed knowing that God was going to be faithful. God's promises are given for us to believe, not merely to quote. That was put in the outline for me, not you. I like to quote God's promises, but they don't mean anything to me or anybody else if I don't believe them and act on them. God's promises are given for us to believe, not just to quote out loud. Someone said, never doubt in the dark what God gave you in the light. I do that. You do that. We all say, well, I'll never do this. And then we get to a situation, and before we even think about it, we're well on our way to doing that very thing we thought we would never do. Why is that? Because we've forgotten. We've forgotten the promises of God, and we have to be reminded of them. To believe a promise of God means you accept it, and then you act upon it. Just to accept it, even to quote it, even to preach it, even to teach it, does not mean you believe it until you act upon it. I have to go through that. You have to remember that. The third lesson is whenever God tests, trust, and he will test. You know Abraham's test, don't you? The big one. We all identify with Abraham. The son of promise, Isaac, is then taken to a place of sacrifice that God asked Abraham to do. Are you willing right now, Abraham, to sacrifice your son, the one you waited so long for, the one you had in your old age, the one Sarah bore when she was way past childbearing age? Will you now let him go and kill him for me if I ask you? Thankfully, God doesn't do that anymore in most cases. But in that day, he did, and Abraham was ready to do it. And so we see whenever God tests, we should trust. The writer of Hebrews says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. We know something about Abraham, don't we, in this episode? We know that Abraham had grown to a place of faith, that he knew God enough that he was able to go through with this horrible thing God had asked him to do, the sacrificing of his own son. Remember back in chapter 25 or 22 of Genesis, verse 5, as they're walking to the place of sacrifice, he and Isaac, Abraham tells his servants who walk with him on the journey, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship. Do you understand what Abraham was saying? Worship in that instance meant we're going to sacrifice Isaac. We're going to plunge a knife into him until he's dead and his blood's going to pour out, and we're going to burn him as a sacrifice to God. But Abraham's saying to the servants who didn't know that God asked him to do this, we are going, but we will come back. Abraham knew something. He knew that he was going to have to sacrifice Isaac, but he also knew that God had promised that Isaac was going to be a descendant, and many of his descendants were going to be a great nation of God's people. He didn't know how God was going to do it. We think he knew that God was going to somehow resurrect Isaac, so he was able to sacrifice Isaac. That was because Abraham had learned step by step, episode by episode, in all those years of following God, that he could now trust God, even when horrible tests come upon him. A test usually makes us feel vulnerable and weak. If it didn't make us feel vulnerable and weak, it wouldn't be a test. It's not a test if it doesn't try us in some way. A test usually makes us feel vulnerable and weak, which leads then to panic. God, wait a minute. Something's wrong here. Are you sure? I don't think it's going to work. I know you created everything, including every molecule of me, but I think you're wrong here. I wonder how many times God listens to that from his followers and just says, okay, think about what you just said. I'll wait. You think I'm wrong. I'm in charge of everything. I created everything. I know everything. I'm all powerful. But on this particular instance, you know more than I do. Okay, I'll wait. Don't you love the patience of God? I wouldn't be here without it. I don't know if any of us would be. We used to panic. We like to panic. We want to panic because we feel vulnerable and weak, and those are not comfortable feelings. But God frequently challenges us to trust him more by giving us far more than we can handle on our own. When people say, with good intentions, well, God never gives you more than you can handle, they don't understand a couple of things. One is, yes, he does. What he does promise, though, is to give you the strength to go through whatever he gives you, which is too much for you on your own to handle. I don't think they mean to contradict God. What they're trying to say is God can walk with you through anything if you take God with you. But if you think when someone says, well, God will give you no more than you can handle, if you think that means you are endowed somehow on your own the ability to gut out something horrible, that's not true at all. Only with God can you handle things, because most things that come your way are beyond your control and beyond our ability to handle on our own. He wants us to turn to him in desperation and ask for his assistance. Why? Because he wants his children to know him. And the more we know him, the more he can bless us. Why does he want to bless us? Because we are his children. That's why we call him Father. If you have kids, you know you want to give your kids everything that they could possibly need. Maybe not what they want, but definitely what they need. Well, that's the third lesson. The fourth and final lesson is, however God blesses, we should share. However God blesses, we should share it. One final high point of Abraham's journey, he was blessed and he shared. Abraham became incredibly wealthy. He did. He had more flocks. He had huge numbers of camels. He had lots of riches. He was able to gift his nephew Lot with large swaths of fertile land, all the sheep and goats and camels Lot could ever need. He made Lot a rich man. He made kings in the area rich men when he fought battles for them. He did this, and they gave him great, great respect because he didn't hoard his wealth. His servants were so loyal to him that he actually sent one of his servants out to pick a wife for his son. You don't do that unless you fully trust the servant, and a servant won't fully trust a master who shortchanges the servants. They were loyal because they saw the generosity of Abraham, and they were so loyal that Abraham trusted them his one servant to even pick out his son's wife, which he did. The only valid reason for anyone to make more than they need is to give away the surplus. To give away the surplus. Now, we're not talking to do this in a financially silly way, to where you sell everything and sit on a corner, on a curb, and wait on God to do something. We're not talking about that. But we are talking about realizing that if we have surplus, everything belongs to God in the first place. But we can reap rewards if we will, in faith, give to God's service those things that He's given us more of that we actually need. And He does that from time to time. God graciously provides an overabundance for one purpose, so that we might share it. So we can give. Now, I'm not preaching to you about giving, because I want to tell you something. You give really, really well here at our church. You really do. We're all the way through the summer. If you want to look at the back of your bulletin and look at the giving report, we went through the dead of summer where our attendance is down and people who are gone don't tend to give, which is, it's up to them. But some of them actually do. We still receive their tithe even when they're gone. But we still have $7 more than we need. And we went through the summer. And all through the summer, we ran a surplus. Now, we ran a bigger surplus last year. You want to know why? Because our budget was lower. We had to raise our budget. You want to know why? Because gas is $3.81 a gallon. And everything goes up. And so we had to go up. And your giving went up a little bit. And so we appreciate that very much. Some of you are very good at sacrificial giving. I just put this in front of you because it bears reminding of us all. This is Chuck Swindoll. He wrote this: the average Christian today gives between 3 and 4% of his or her discretionary income to God's work. Imagine the problems ministries could solve if Christians followed Abraham's example and had donated at least 10% of their income. It's a good word from Chuck Swindoll, former president of Dallas Theological, great pastor and author. Giving generously requires faith that God will really look after your needs. It's a step of faith He's asking you to do. If I give that, Father, will I have enough? Father, and God is saying, well, trust me. Trust me. I own everything. Are you really asking your Father if you're going to have enough? I own everything. Everything you own, you're borrowing from me. After you die, it comes back to me. Well, I'm going to give it to my kids. It's going to come back to me eventually. That's what God is saying. You are good stewards when you are able to give generously. We'll take this with you this morning. Abraham's story is our story. You have to understand that his story is really our story. He was human. He didn't get it right a lot. But even though he didn't get it right a lot, we see great examples of his faith. Each of us has been called to embark on a great spiritual journey toward a destination God will show us. We don't know how our lives are going to end up yet. We don't know what's going to happen in that issue that's plaguing you right now, that's burdening your heart, that's keeping you awake, that's causing you indigestion. We don't know how it's going to end. We know this, that God knows all about it. And God knows how it's going to end. Are you ready this morning to take your faith journey? If you're not there, there's no time like right now to start. Are you ready to say, Father, I'm tired of being impressed with Jesus. I want to surrender to Him. I want to walk as Abraham walked. Would you give God a few moments of your time right now and just let Him talk to you? Many questions will come, and worry will keep you from making that first step. But God is asking you to trust Him right now, to admit you're a sinner, to believe that Jesus is the only way, to commit to taking each step as He leads you to. See this card in your bulletin. If you're new here, please fill that out. We'd love to have a record of your visit. You don't have to. But if God is speaking to you this morning and you want to have someone to talk to, I would be glad to do that. It doesn't have to be me. It could be people sitting around you that you know in this room right now. But would you do me a favor? Put your name and a way to contact you if you would. And under this heading which says, I'd like to know more about, at the bottom of the front of the card, the first check box is becoming a follower of Jesus. If you have questions, would you check that? You're not committing to doing anything other than letting me know, and I will talk to you and have a conversation with you this week if you want that. If you fill out this card for any reason today, would you put it in the offering box as you leave this morning, right outside the wooden doors there behind you? Well, let's leave with this understanding. No one is perfect. Not us or the heroes we admire. I admire Colson a lot, but boy, did he ever blow it. Boy, did he have some bad ideas. Boy, did he misunderstand some things and wind up in prison. Boy, did he pay a price. But then God spoke to him and he listened. And now Colson, along with Abraham and others even, are heroes of our faith. Abraham is real to us. Not despite of his frailties and his mistakes, but because he had mistakes and frailties. You and I have them too. We have moments where our faith will fail us. We have moments when we'll hesitate. We have moments when we'll do the wrong thing. Even though we have a track record for many times doing the right thing, we'll still sometimes mess it up. That's why Abraham is such an example to us, because he messed up too. And we can follow him as he follows Jesus. Lord in heaven, would you bless us today to not let our mistakes and our failures keep us from trying again. But let us remember that Abraham, who made more than his share, never stopped, and you rewarded him. Father, so much so that we're talking about him thousands and thousands of years after his death. We're lifting him up as an example that you put in your word to show us this is real, and we can walk and follow you. Thank you for this journey through the life of Abraham. Would you bless us now with our next step, to identify it as coming from you, and to know what the next step is and take it, even though we don't know where eventually you will lead. Father, we thank you and praise your name in Jesus' name. Amen.